Back to that trees of Georgia. Like I was saying, Georgia is a great state for trees. Not only do we produce a lot for timber and for other purposes, but we also have a lot of forests, a lot of tree biodiversity, which means a great variety of different types of trees, some of the most in the nation. That's kind of because we are the southern range of a lot of Appalachian and northern species, and we are at the northern range here in the Georgia Piedmont of a lot of southern and coastal and swamp species. So, a pretty cool place to be if you like trees. We have over 250 different species, over 20 species of native oaks. I think it's 32 total. I used to think we had the most in the nation. I think northern Mexico actually has us beat, which breaks my heart, but still have lots of cool other trees, about like 5 or 7 species of maple, 11 native pine species, 7 native magnolia species. Um, yeah, I'm going to talk a lot about native trees and the importance of native trees here. And the great thing about Georgia is no matter what kind of site you are planting in, there's probably a native species of tree to fill that niche, whether you're planting in clay soil versus well-drained soil, wet areas, dry areas, rocky areas. There's probably a native tree for everything. What do I really mean when I say native trees, too? I want to talk about this because this pertains a lot to tree benefits. So I kind of break down plants into 3 categories. You have native species like this staghorn sumac down there, or things like a white oak or tulip poplar. Those are species that have evolved in this area for thousands, if not millions of years. They've developed symbiosis and balance with other species around them in the ecosystem. So you may have like aggressive natives. For example, like a box elder can take over a whole floodplain, but they don't take over the entire ecosystem. They tend to have different niches and different factors, pests and competition that regulate their spread. We also have a lot of non-native introduced species that aren't invasive that do provide a lot of benefit to us, especially in the urban area. Those would be things like your crepe myrtles, maybe even the white clover and crabgrass in your yard. These are things that were introduced from elsewhere, but that for the most part stay in their place or will not colonize entire native ecosystems. The ones that do that are what we call invasive species. So invasive species are introduced for the most part, but invasive is really more of an indicator of behavior than of origin. So an invasive species is one like kudzu or English ivy or Callery pear that can take over the entire ecosystem, does not have those checks and balances on its growth, and that can kind of outcompete the forest. So there are places sometimes when you're planting that you might need to put a non-native tree. I always recommend trying to plant native if you can, but sometimes in parking lots or streetscapes, especially if you've got a lot of asphalt, poor soil, reflective heat, sometimes only non-native trees will thrive in that spot, like a crepe myrtle. But I recommend knowing your species and making sure you're never planting invasive species because those take out forests through a variety of different means. We'll talk a little bit about that later. There are also other terms you'll hear to describe species and their origins and behavior, things like exotic or alien. I mostly just stick to these 3 because that I think kind of defines what they do in the ecosystem pretty well. But why natives over non-natives or invasives? Well, native trees are already adapted to this climate, so they're adapted to our soil, our weather patterns for the most part. So a lot of times that can come with lower maintenance of them. Also, native trees, especially mature, big native trees, and even more so, large patches of native forest, provide a lot of these things called ecosystem services, which we'll talk about in a bit. Those are just all the benefits that trees and forests bring to our life. So, a large native tree provides more of those services than a smaller non-native tree, but a intact, healthy native forest provides the most of those services. So things like water filtration, soil stabilization, aesthetic value. Native patches of forest are the most important for that. I think there's kind of this misperception out there that a lot of our urban forestry problems and the loss of canopy that we're experiencing in Georgia can be combated just by planting more trees. But that's not entirely true. We can't really plant our way out of climate change and out of some of the problems we're facing. So we do have to conserve what we already have, especially those intact forest patches, if we want to receive most of these ecosystem services. So you'll hear me use this term a lot. This is what we're kind of going to be talking about the most today. Ecosystem services are just those direct and indirect benefits that humans receive from our ecosystems, but also from individual trees as well. So we can kind of break those down into four things. The most obvious ones being these provisioning services. So those are the kinds of things that we tend to take from our forests. So timber, wood fiber, fruit, all kinds of other great stuff. That's very important here in Georgia, where forestry is such a economic driver. They also have a lot of supporting services. So these are the things that might not be as visible, but that do make our quality of life a lot better. So these are things like that nutrient cycling. So how trees drop wood that turns into soil, so on and so forth, and create habitat for fungi to live that break down material. Also things like habitat provision, so supporting the habitat and the whole ecosystem of the forest. We are a very vegetated state here. Most of our wildlife need trees or certain plants to survive. So then we also have our regulating services. These are the ones that probably help make our life the most livable here. So those are things like slowing down stormwaters and helping with flood regulation, controlling erosion and sedimentation of our creeks, making the climate a little cooler in the summer. So regulating that environment and making it more livable for us. So beyond that, we have the cultural services, and these might be, some of the most important to us as tree huggers, right? So these are the aesthetic, the cultural, the spiritual value that you get out of trees and forests, the decreased stress that you get living in an environment with trees, the aesthetic value you might get from a forest, the recreational value you might get from a park that has a forest with trails in it that you can use. So these are ecosystem services. And like I said, our native trees provide the most of these, and our native forests provide even more, which is why it's important to not just plant, but also protect what we have. You can also break down these ecosystem services into environmental benefits. So again, the larger the tree, the more bang for your buck on these. One of the biggest ones we have is air quality, right? So trees photosynthesize. So they take in sunlight into their leaves and produce sugars through that. And also through that, there is a process of respiration. That respiration involves them taking in carbon dioxide from the air through pores in their leaves called stomata, or pores in their bark called lenticels. But they take in that carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, which we need to breathe. So trees are super important for air quality, especially in the city where you have industry and lots of traffic and other things emitting pollutants into the air. The Forest Service estimates this service at $3.8 billion is the value, they say, of air pollution removed annually by urban trees. That data is, I think, at least 5 years old, so that could be even more by now. Trees provide a lot of biodiversity and that habitat. So this is where native trees are really important. So it's said that a matured native oak can support over 500 different types of pollinators. I think there's a lot of awareness going on right now about the decline in pollinator populations we've had over the last few decades. We've all heard of the save the bees, right? Plant native wildflowers and things for pollinators. And while that's super important for providing that food for those pollinators, a lot of our pollinators need specific native trees as their host species to live in, essentially, and to reproduce in. So there's a great book out there called Bringing Nature Home by Doug Ptolemy. He talks a lot about how you can increase biodiversity and these environmental benefits in your own landscaping in your own yards. But a lot of that involves planting native trees. So we have a lot of many unique species here in Georgia. A lot of them are generalists, things like a raccoon or a white-tailed deer that can survive in a variety of environments and climates, from the woods to the suburbs to the city. But we have a lot of species, especially insects, that are specialist species. So specialist means they need another type of life form to complete their life cycle. So a lot of them need a specific native tree to host on. An example of this would be like monarchs and milkweed, right? They need that plant to eat and then reproduce in. So if you provide native trees and conserve native forests, you provide a host and that habitat for those specialist insects. Those insects in turn feed the birds feed the predators, and you kind of build up that food chain. So that is a very important species or benefit that trees and forests provide. Sometimes it can also not just be in providing that home and that habitat, but also by altering the climate. of the area can be another service they provide. So, for example, up in North Georgia, uh, a lot of our streams are cold and clear, and a lot of the wildlife, the insects, the fish, etc., require that cold, clear water. And so having shade over those streams and trees on the banks is vital for preventing sedimentation and cooling down the water, especially in the summer. Um, Speaking of shade, that's another huge environmental benefit that trees provide. I grew up in the middle of Atlanta in the city, and we had trees in our neighborhood though. And I remember walking off Peachtree Street into our neighborhood and feeling that temperature drop by about 15 degrees just right as soon as you get into the neighborhood. So that's not just a comfort benefit, it truly is a public safety benefit as well, the shade that trees provide. Uh, as our climate continues to get hotter and hotter, there are more and more heat related deaths in the state or heat related medical emergencies. So, having trees in cities to help cool things down is vital to quality of life in those cities, especially for elderly, young folks, folks without homes and shelter. Having some trees in the city can really make those summers more livable and also lower your power bill by shading your house as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Carbon sequestration is another vital service that trees and forests provide. So, carbon sequestration means the way that those trees take that CO2 in from the air and eventually convert it into biomass, their wood, their cellulose, their leaves. Eventually, that, or at least some of it, breaks down into the soil and is stored as carbon in the soil. So, they reduce carbon in the atmosphere by that sequestration. They also reduce carbon in the atmosphere, though, by reducing the amount of emissions you need for heating or cooling. So having shade over your house means you're going to need to use less power for your AC to cool it in the summer. There's one study done in the city of Chicago where they estimated that the trees annually sequestered the equivalent amount of carbon that was emitted by all forms of transportation in 1 week. So, in other words, all cars, buses, trains, whatever going through the city, all their emissions for 1 week were offset by the trees in the city. So you basically got 1 week of free pollution, so to speak. Um, erosion and water quality are other two really important ecosystem services that trees provide, especially here in the Georgia Piedmont. A lot of our forests are super resilient. A lot of them were cut down for agriculture or timber 50 to 100 to 200 years ago. And many of those forests have regrown into what we call secondary succession forests, where the native canopy grew back and you have these beautiful native hardwood forests. However, our waterways and our creeks often tell the full story of that land use, that because they are not quite as resilient as our forested lands. So sedimentation is the number one pollutant in Georgia waterways here in the Piedmont. So that is all of the silt, sand, and clay and debris from construction and grading and development, and stuff that the forest would absorb if it fell on the forest floor, but instead is washed off of our concrete and pavement into the creek. So most creeks in this area should have a pretty rocky, clear bottom. You'll notice most of them don't. It's sandy. That's that sedimentation. And forests are one of the best tools for slowing that down and absorbing that sedimentation. So there's one study that showed that a 21% existing tree canopy can reduce stormwater runoff by 15%. So a lot of our cities in Georgia are closer to 40% forested or 40% canopy. So that's 30% of that stormwater surge that is being absorbed by those trees. And again, big, mature native trees and forests do this the best. So that's super important, especially as we're experiencing larger flood cycles here. So pollution too, and pollution in the air. So that's another vital thing that trees help clean up, more or less. So there's one study at the University of Iowa and University of Washington that indicate that trees can break down pesticides and carcinogenic groundwater contaminants. So things like atrazine and chlorines, they can convert those into harmless compounds through their biological cycles. Likewise, that same study in Chicago estimated that trees in the city annually removed, and get ready for the numbers here, 15 metric tons of carbon monoxide, 84 tons of sulfur dioxide, 89 tons of nitrogen dioxide, 191 tons of ozone, and 212 tons of small particulate matter. So that is a ton of air pollution. That is a lot better air quality that affects people, especially with respiratory issues. So the value of that pollution removal was estimated at 1 million for the trees in the city itself and 9.2 million for the entire Chicago area. There's a lot of work right now to try and put a monetary value on these ecosystem services. It's often hard to do with not a one-to-one comparison, but I'm glad we have these numbers for making the case that trees and forests in our city matter. So beyond that, trees provide a lot of socioeconomic benefits. Some of these are probably more visible than others, but the U.S. Forest Service has said that every $1 you spend on trees, you reap $2.70 in benefits. That's a heck of a return on an investment there. If someone came to me, my friend came up to me and said, "Hey, Dave, I want you to invest in my business, right? For every dollar you give me, I can give you a 270% return." I don't think I'd believe him, right? But these are the incredible value that trees provide in our cities. So trees, we like to think of them as a natural green infrastructure that reduces or even replaces the need for constructed infrastructure solutions. So take stormwater, for example, right? Trees could kind of reduce the impact or even potentially replace having to have some kind of stormwater catchment system, or can be used in that system to help soak up some of that water. So we like to call trees infrastructure here in urban forestry. So they're not just beautification or things that, maybe provide a little bit of cooling and shade. They are infrastructure in the same way a sidewalk or a sewer is infrastructure. They're vital resources to keep our cities clean and livable. Trees can also increase property values. One study showed that can be anywhere from 5 to 18%. People like living around trees. There's something in our brain that is healed by that in a way. There's one study that analyzed how long shoppers spent at businesses that had trees in front of them versus those that didn't. And the shoppers tended to linger around a lot longer in the landscapes with trees. I often work with cities where they're working with their downtown kind of business district, and people are cutting down trees because they're blocking their signs. So I always think this statistic and study is very important for kind of counteracting that, especially when there is pruning you can do and crown raising to work around that and creative solutions there. So trees have a benefit on our health, both physically and mentally. There's one study that showed that patients in hospitals who have a view of trees out their window spent 8% or so fewer days in the hospital. Likewise, residents with higher tree canopy, there's a correlation between that and fewer prescription antidepressants taken. I mean, I'm sure we can all relate to some point in our life where trees or access to a forest have lowered our stress and lowered our cortisol levels. Trees also can slow down vehicles too. Studies have shown that people driving through tree-lined streets tend to drive a little slower and careful than cars driving through areas without any trees. So these are more rough correlations, that are not as easily measurable as things like, air quality or particulate matter. But my experience around trees also reinforces this idea that trees help make a community healthier, both mentally and physically. They also provide a lot of aesthetic value to our life, right? Trees are pretty. We like living around them. There are lots of native trees out there that can provide beautiful fall color or beautiful spring flowers. So they just make our landscapes a little better to live in. Beyond that, forestry products are an important socioeconomic benefit of trees, especially here in Georgia. We're number one in forestry. It is a $39.1 billion industry in Georgia. That's our biggest agricultural product in the state. So providing timber and wood chips and wood pulp for paper production and a host of other chemicals you get from that process as well. So here in the urban areas, it's estimated that the urban forestry business, so that includes management of urban trees, tree services, removal, pruning, urban wood reuse as mulch or woodworking products or whatever, all of that combines to about a $7 billion industry here in Georgia. So as we continue to grow as a state, we have more and more people living amongst trees and more need to manage them to provide these benefits. But sometimes that management in itself can be a socioeconomic benefit through job creation. I'd like to pause and give a little example of what this looks like. If y'all are not familiar with iTree, it is a really awesome suite of software tools that you can use to inventory and get more information on the trees and forests around you. So itreetools.org there. Specifically, we're going to look at their MyTree application. This is a really cool tool that allows you to calculate the benefits of individual trees. So let me pull that up here and I can show you what that looks like for a couple trees outside of my office and the benefits they provide. So I ran two trees through the simulation. One is a roughly 20-inch white oak that is to the west of my office, and one is a 16-inch crepe myrtle that is on the north end of my office. So let's look at their benefits here. This tool is really cool. You enter in your species, size, the approximate like distance and direction from any building, and it gives you this nutrition facts of trees for both this year or for 20 years. So it's estimated that the benefits of this 20-inch white oak are about $40 worth, right? That doesn't really sound like a lot till you start to break down some of these numbers in here. So the carbon dioxide uptake that's valued at $10, again, doesn't sound like a lot until you look at how many pounds of carbon that is sequestered. So that's carbon turned into wood and plant material, or carbon taken out of the air. 170 pounds of carbon dioxide feels like a lot more than $10, right? Same with the stormwater mitigation, right? $4 doesn't sound like a whole lot of benefit, but that is 3,000 gallons of rainfall that is intercepted and absorbed by that tree that could otherwise run off into our creek and increase flooding and sedimentation. So, or 538 gallons of runoff. I'm not entirely sure what the distinction between those two is. But this is a great tool. You can see, how much of each type of pollutant your tree absorbed and how much estimated energy savings it's doing to you per year. So that might not sound like much, right? But over time, and if this tree is taken care of, it could be here another 100, 200 years. But over time, that energy over 20 years could be $193. I mean, that's more than a cup of coffee, right? That's no joke. So trees can save you money. So they also have this really cool equivalence thing here. So if you look at what that translates to in more viewable terms, so that's 188 miles worth of CO2 emissions from a typical passenger vehicle that you are saving by having this tree in your landscape and not removing it and taking care of it. So, or 118 bathtubs full of bath water, right? Or full of water that you're absorbing that's not running off into your creek. Or I don't know why they chose smartphones for their unit of measurement here, but if you added up all the particulate matter and gas and gaseous pollutants that tree is absorbing, it's equivalent to the weight of 5 smartphones. And again, over 20 years, these are just exacerbated even more. And the great thing about a well taken care of tree is it should last more than 20 years. So a lot of our urban trees don't. So let's compare that to a smaller non-native tree here. So this is a crepe myrtle, very common landscaping tree that does not provide a lot of those ecosystem services. So we had almost $40 there in value for the oak. And we have about $3 here for the value of that crepe myrtle. But even this non-native tree is still providing a lot of benefits. And this isn't even accounting for things like aesthetic benefit or more intangible things like that are harder to measure. So that's about 19 or 20 pounds of carbon dioxide that it's put on as wood weight, and that's about 72 pounds that it's taken out of the air. That's quite a bit of water diverted from running off of our parking lot into the creek next door. And over 20 years, that's over 1,000 miles worth of CO2 emissions from a car, right? So this is just an example of some of those benefits that are provided by trees, and iTree is a really cool tool to get some data on that. So going back to my slides here. So those are all the benefits that trees give us. We're going to get a little bit more doom and gloom here and talk about some threats to native biodiversity that are happening and what you can do to mitigate those threats and keep trees and forests in your community and receive all those benefits. So our trees are subject to a variety of threats that threaten to kill or destroy them. One of those are pests and diseases. Some of these are part of our natural forest cycles, things that are native to this ecosystem and exist naturally. A lot of them are exacerbated in urban areas because these trees are under so much stress, not having the rooting volume or the conditions that they would ideally like to have. So they're more susceptible to pest infestations. So they're not always necessarily a bad thing, but they certainly can be. For example, the southern pine beetle, right? We had a huge outbreak of this in Northwest Georgia these last couple of years. It's a native insect that is part of our forest cycle. It's a beetle that targets and mostly kills old and unhealthy pine trees, right? So it gets rid of those and allows sunlight to come to the forest floor for the regeneration of the next stage of forest life. But obviously, that's a huge problem when you're getting a bunch of really tall pine trees dying in an urban area next to streets and cars and pedestrians and all that. Or when it's in a timber stand that was someone's, economic investment. So we also have a lot of pests like this woolly hemlock adelgid here. I'm sure some of y'all might be familiar with that are non-native and that are really having a really bad effect on trees, especially those that are also stressed by the factories of being in an urban area. So hemlock woolly adelgid, this is an insect, I believe from Southeast Asia that affects our eastern hemlock species in North Georgia. Basically eats these needles off at the base, defoliates the tree, eventually killing it, which has a cascading effect on those ecosystem services. So hemlocks are one of those big trees that has traditionally shaded trout streams in North Georgia and kept them cool and clear. So without that, the forest kind of has to replace that with other trees. So you're getting kind of a heat up of streams. So pests are a big threat to trees, especially in urban areas. Sometimes can wipe out almost the entirety of a genus, like the emerald ash borer has really made elm not really a super viable tree to plant in urban areas anymore. The biggest threat to trees and forests in Georgia, though, is development. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but Georgia is experiencing a lot of canopy loss due to development, particularly in North Georgia and on coastal cities like Savannah and whatnot. So from 2001 to 2021, it's estimated that Georgia lost 3.42 million hectares of tree cover. So that's roughly equivalent to a 35% decrease since 2000. So that equates to 1.43 gigatons of CO2 emissions that those trees would otherwise be absorbing. So development is a huge threat to our canopy. This is one thing we try and work on at the Georgia Forestry Commission, is working with cities to find ways to have smarter development and ways that conserve existing trees and forests or involve more replanting. So it's estimated that Georgia loses around an average of 18,000 acres of trees per year. I should note that loss is not evenly distributed around the state. In fact, a lot of counties in South Georgia are actually gaining tree canopy due to replanting for timber. But definitely where you see that urban development in North Georgia and on the coast, we're seeing a lot of tree loss. There are also things like natural disasters. Invasive species. So with that development comes a lot of soil disturbance and land disturbance, right? And new sunlight into the forest when you chop down trees, right? So this creates an environment for invasive species, which are a big threat to native trees. Things like English ivy or kudzu or wisteria do threaten to take out acres and acres of native forests, as well as those individual trees in our landscape. So some of them do this very directly, like this wisteria vine that can kind of coil along and kill an individual tree. Some of them, it's more of a indirect thing, like English ivy, for example, spreads along the ground. It can also spread up and kill individual trees, but it also spreads along the ground and prevents the germination and the development of new seedlings in the forest floor. So you'll see trees sometimes where you have this nice, oak and hickory or pine or whatever canopy of native trees, but then underneath it's all invasives overtaking the understory and ground cover. So there's not that new generation of trees coming in to replace those old ones as they die. So eventually you can lose the whole forest to invasives that way. Likewise, natural disasters pose a big threat to our trees and our canopy. Hurricane Helene this year created mass disturbance in our forests and lost a lot of trees. So hurricanes, tornadoes, ice storms, microbursts all threaten to increase canopy loss in our state. Wildfire, too, is another one. We are a fire-dependent ecosystem here in Georgia. All of our forests technically should naturally burn anywhere from 1 year in parts of South Georgia and like longleaf pine ecosystems to like 10 years or so up in the mountains. But a lot of our fire has been suppressed throughout the state, which means you get a lot of dead wood, a lot of fuel in our forests if they're not burned as regularly as they should be. So when that fire does come in, it spreads up into the canopy and kills the mature trees and can take out large patches of forest. So natural disasters are another thing that threaten our trees. Let's talk about some metrics, though, because I really want to focus on the development component here, because that is the largest threat to our tree cover here in Georgia. So in 1985, and this is all data from Georgia Tech's canopy study that they recently published. Great study. If you want to link to that, please contact me. I'll send you it. This is also info taken from Global Forest Watch. They have a great website where you can see canopy loss by county and land cover by county. But you can kind of see here the expansion of the metro areas here in Savannah and Augusta and Atlanta over time. That red and yellow, that red being urban development, the yellow and brown being more agriculture, and the greens being forested land. So you can see that spread starting to happen over time due to urban sprawl, right? So we'll talk about ways to combat this in a bit, but right now this is the biggest threat to our forest in Georgia. So in 1985, we had an estimated 62% forest cover, which is now at 56% for 2023. So enough of that doom and gloom, though. Let's talk about what you can do to help native trees in your community and improve their life and their situation and get a lot more of these ecosystem services and benefits that we talk about. So I know we said that planting is not a substitution for the conservation of large existing trees and existing forest patches, but it is vitally important to the preservation and continuation of our urban forest. The plantings done by groups like Trees Atlanta and other, community volunteers are one of the reasons Atlanta is able to call itself the city in the trees, right? A lot of our canopy comes from things that individual folks have planted. So if you're interested in planting trees in your area, let us know. We have a lot of advice if you're trying to do it on private property, and a lot of services we can offer if you're trying to do it on public property. We do have a grant for that, for planting on public property as well. We can provide you with planting plans, help you find a nursery, suggest species. We even do some tree giveaways around the state too, and sometimes work with the extension to do those. So planting trees is an obvious way to help your urban forest and get back a lot of those benefits over time, even if it might not be you and your generation benefiting the most from them. But like I said, that conservation of what we already have is super important. So, if there are groups like Trees Atlanta or Friends of Parks groups or, things like Keep XYZ Beautiful groups in your area that do work to pick up trash or remove invasive species or help clean up and preserve forests in your area, that is great stuff to do. I also, if you have trees or forests on your property, I highly, highly, highly recommend, if not only for safety reasons, hiring qualified professionals to manage those trees. So I always tell folks that, a couple $100 for someone to come out and assess the trees on your property could save you several thousand in removals when they tell you that actually all these trees over here are safe and you have, X amount of years before you really should start worrying about them. But hiring qualified arborists to care for your trees is a great way to help them get to that full maturity where they're providing the most of those ecosystem services. So if you're trying to find those professionals, I'd recommend either going to treesaregood.org is a great website where you can look up consulting arborists by zip code. Or if you're looking for a qualified tree service, I'd recommend going to Georgia Arborist Association's website and hitting that Find a Professional button in the middle of the page. So again, that's treesaregood.org and Georgia Arborist Association. Likewise, advocacy. We need people to speak for the trees in their community. Go to city council and talk about the importance of the importance of trees in your community. So talk to your neighbors about this kind of thing, right? If there are opportunities to conserve or help trees in your neighborhood, spread the word about it. Maybe there's a local tree board you can join. Maybe there's opportunities through the extension to learn more about trees like y'all are doing today. Is a great thing. So likewise, find professionals that can help you. That includes us here at GFC. We are available to help with a variety of urban forestry issues on public property. So there are resources out there to help you manage your trees. One of those largest resources is your local government, though, that regulates how trees are treated in the city. So, we talked a lot about the loss of trees we have due to new developments in the state. One of the biggest ways we have to reduce that tree loss on new developments is through strong tree ordinances and having arborists in city government to help enforce those ordinances. So that is something we do a lot here at GFC, trying to find ways to incentivize the conservation of trees and forests on new developments. Because, for example, if you had a new development and you just put as many single family lots in it as possible with the one red maple in each lot required to meet the bare minimum of the ordinance and then call it a day and get your certificate of occupancy, you're not going to get as many ecosystem benefits as if you maybe made a couple of those lots more dense in order to conserve existing patches of forest that you would have otherwise clear cut. So we want to work with developers and with cities to grow smartly, right? Because Georgia's growing, that's happening, but there are ways you can do it that conserve more trees as you go. So having strong tree ordinances is a super important part of this. Having arborists and trained professionals on city staff, whether that's a specific arborist for your city or just someone in planning and development who knows trees and knows what to look for on those sites. Likewise, having a tree board is a great thing for a city to have if they're trying to get the most ecosystem benefits from their tree. Whether that's, government, civilian run, tree boards look different all throughout the state, but they're an important part of that urban forestry program to help manage trees in the city. Likewise, education. What y'all are doing here today is the first and very important step in helping trees in your community. So take classes like these, talk to your neighbors about it too, send them our way. Spread the good word about trees because, like I said, the benefits they provide are really insurmountable. They keep our cities livable, and they truly are green infrastructure and not just beautification or aesthetics. So I appreciate y'all coming to listen to me today. I'm going to check on the chat here and see if we have any questions, and then I'll kind of open it up to anyone to ask things.
Yeah, if you have any more questions, there's a couple in there, but if you have any questions, even if you don't think it's that important, go ahead and type that in there.
So someone asked, if you're going to reforest a homestead acre property, Dave, what 2 tree types would you recommend as preferable selections and why? Great question. Unfortunately, I am going to give you the forestry answer here, which is it depends. So our forests kind of go through a natural succession process with different stages of forest that are dominated by different species. So if you have say like an open lot, it's just like grass or scrub or meadow or whatever that's getting a lot of sunlight, you don't really have that forest community there already. You're probably going to want to plant pioneer species, so native species that grow tall and fast and kind of help create that first wave of forest. So that's things like loblolly pine, black cherry, winged elm, sweet gum. I know most people don't plant sweet gums. You probably could just wait and you'll have sweet gum trees. But yeah, so those, we call them edge species, right? That live on the edge of the forest. So if there is more of an existing forest there and there is some shade and some of that rich like forest soil there, you might want to go more for those what we call the climax community, so the final stage of forest development. So here in the Georgia Piedmont, that usually means oaks and hickories. But again, this is going to depend on your soil and slopes and hydrology and lots of other stuff. I recommend if you Google Ask the Arborist, it should take you to our Ask the Arborist webpage. You can send me pictures of the site and I can try and answer there. Someone asked me, what is my favorite tree? That's such a hard answer. It's like asking a parent what their favorite child is, which, I mean, I guess I do have a favorite though. That would be Southern White Oak. So Quercus alba, that's because it is that climax community species in our forest that provides the most of those ecosystem services. It's the primary mast producer, so the primary food producer for a lot of our wildlife. It kind of replaced the American chestnut as the important, dominant canopy mass producing species in North Georgia when the chestnut blight came. So I find that really inspiring. Kathleen also asked, how can I help trees in my neighborhood? Great question. Depends on where your neighborhood's at in your city. If there are spaces to plant on public property, I would recommend reaching out to Georgia Forestry Commission, and we'd love to try and work with your city to get some trees in there. But also be that squeaky wheel in your community too. If you see things that are not that are violations of your tree ordinance, be that squeaky wheel and report that to the city. If you see just your neighbors cutting down trees that don't necessarily need to be cut down, talk to them. Another important thing is too, we're seeing a lot of tree loss around Georgia due to insurance companies. They are using aerial footage or drone footage, and insurance adjusters states away that don't live here in Georgia are demanding people cut or prune trees that look like they're hanging over the house on Google Maps or on their drone footage, and threatening to drop people or charge them more if they don't do something about those trees. That is honestly pretty awful and just not in is just not congruent with how trees are managed. You cannot assess tree safety from aerial photography, right? So we have standards for how tree risk is assessed in our industry, and you have to go out there and look at the actual tree to say that it is a risk. So if you hear about this happening in your neighborhood, send your neighbors to Georgia Arborist Association's website under our homeowner tab, which I can post here in the chat. We have resources to combat that and a letter you can send to your adjuster. We have had success with that and kind of pushing back and saying that this is not in accordance with industry standard. It can actually create even more tree risk if you're doing unnecessary pruning and practices on a tree. So yeah, check out that link there if you hear about that. And she also asked, did I like the trees walking in Lord of the Rings? Yes, I love the end. It's one of my favorite scenes. We got any other questions or comments or anything? Cool. Well, if not, I guess I'm ending a little bit early there. I will go ahead and drop a link to that Ask the Arborist website in the chat. If you have any questions about trees, you can send them to my email on this website here.
And don't forget about sending them to Extension as well.
An extension as well, yes, because I actually do not know everything about trees, believe it or not, and extension often helps me with those questions I don't know. So
for those that do have issues where you want someone to, you have a problem, there's a disease issue. Remember with Extension, we do have all of the specialists at PhD specialists and disease clinic at our disposal. So if we can't do it, then we could always submit pictures, do site visits. We work with Georgia Forestry, and we're here also for unbiased scientific information and helping you figure out what you need to do if your tree is a lost cause, if it's salvageable, and we can help with those next steps. So please don't forget about that, folks. Plug for Extension.
That's right. Not just for trees, but any kind of natural resource or horticulture or agriculture question you have. Extensions are such a great resource. We're so glad to have them.
And we can tell them to we can refer folks to you.
That's right. That's right.
We're the traffic coordinators, if you will.
Yep. I mean, there are a lot of issues too that we cannot handle here at Georgia Forestry Commission, especially when it comes to private property or the commercial tree industry, right? But if we cannot help you with a problem, we probably know someone who can. So, and like I said, getting professional help and learning about trees is such an important factor in conserving them and getting all these benefits out of them. It looks like I have a couple more questions here I'll address real quick. Someone asked, is that a white oak in the picture behind me? I don't know. I just found that in our office and liked it, so I put it on the wall. Someone asked, how long do most trees live? Again, forestry answer there, it depends. We have some species that can live up to like 400 years old. So some of our live oaks in South Georgia are around that age. We have ones like the village oak, which is the largest live oak in the nation that I believe was like around at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So they can get really old. Most trees in urban areas, though, don't get past 30 years if you're lucky. And that's just due to all the stressors that they face, and a lot of times the wrong species being planted in the wrong place. Or just things like vandalism, getting hit by cars. Or those pests that they're more susceptible to because they're stressed. So I kind of say trees in their age are a little bit like a goldfish in their size. Like technically a goldfish can, grow to its size, but usually like to any size, but in the lake, they usually top out at around here if you put them in open water, which they're invasive in a lot of areas. But, and that's just because of constraints like, water pressure and food access and all sorts of other stuff. But technically they could grow to like a massive size. Trees with age are kind of like that. They could potentially grow forever and ever and ever, right? But factors like gravity and pests and other stressors are probably not going to enable them to live that long. So, yeah, thank you all again for coming today. I really appreciate it. Thank you again, Lisa, for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
And this is recorded, so if you popped in partway through, no worries. Again, it's recorded. I put in the chat the location that the recording will be, the MetroMaster Gardener YouTube channel. So give me probably till tomorrow afternoon and it'll be up there along with several others. And Dave will send me a copy of his slide deck and I will distribute that to anyone who's interested. So you can see my email address in there. Go ahead and email me with the request and I'll get that sent out when I get it from Dave. And that's basically it. Dave, you got anything else to say? Nope. Thanks for attending, everybody, and I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving, safe travels if you're going anywhere, and we will catch you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.